Hey folks, and welcome to the show today. I want to talk for a brief period of time today about gaps in your CV or resume, periods of time when you don't have a job to put in your resume in order to show recruiters. So we're going to talk a little bit about common reasons why people have gaps in their resume. Some are general and some are specific to grad students. We're going to talk about why recruiters look for gaps and the things that they are looking for. And then we're also going to talk about what to do to address these gaps, both in your resume and also in interviews. And I will share a little bit of my own experience because I had a gap on my resume when I entered the industry workforce looking for a job. So, first off, right off the bat, gaps in your resume. Common reasons why people have gaps in your resume. These are just general. The most common ones are caregiving. Either you become a parent and you choose to stay at home and care for a child, or you have an aging or an ill relative, like a parent or an elder, and you want to care for them in the home, and so you take time off of work in order to do those activities. So, caregiving. Another one is taking a break or traveling. A lot of people will do this after they finish college or in between big job shifts that they do. Another common one is medical leave. There are many medical conditions that people can get that prohibits them from being involved in the job force. And so that's a common one as well. And then, of course, being laid off, particularly if you're laid off during a recession or you're laid off from a position or a field where jobs are more scarce, or there's just often a longer period between getting jobs. It may take you 6 months to a year to find your next position if you're in a super specific market. So those are common reasons that everyone might have a gap in their resume. And so specifically for grad students, there are a couple that I often hear about, and then I'll also talk about my own reason for having a gap in my resume. Number one, waiting out for another year on the academic job market cycle. So, of course, we know academic jobs start coming out in the fall and then through the winter, and then by the spring, most jobs have been posted, and in the summer, basically nothing gets posted. So, and if you miss that period in the fall to winter and you either didn't apply to jobs in time, or maybe you applied and you didn't get anything or didn't get anything you wanted, and you want to stay in academia, of course, you're probably just going to sit around for another year on the job market. That's a decision tons of people make. And that may be a gap you need to explain, particularly if you graduate and then you basically can't say you're no longer a student, and maybe you don't have the funds to work in your mentor's lab, or you don't want to, and you don't want to take an adjunct position. Maybe you just want to focus on publishing for a little bit. You may have to explain that gap. Typically, gaps under 6 months really aren't something that you have to talk about that much. But once it gets to 6 months to a year, that's probably going to be something you have to address. And once it becomes more than a year, it's most likely something you're going to have to talk about. So waiting out for another academic job cycle is a reason many grad students or many graduates of grad school have gaps in their resume and CV. Another one is finishing up projects for a mentor for free. And this is, something a lot of people might bump into. Many people start their next job with a couple unfinished projects that their mentor kind of expects them to finish up or pushes them to finish up. And that may, if you're not starting a job, that could delay you in the job search and could stretch out a gap in your resume. Another one is being burnt out. And, it's a super unfortunate thing, but grad school is pretty stressful. And a lot of people, once they finish that race, they just kind of feel like collapsing. And I totally understand that feeling. And so many people may have a 3 or 4 month gap, maybe longer, in between graduating and maybe even starting to look for a job. If they have the financial means to take that time off and they really do feel burnt out, then, maybe they're doing that. And then, of course, another one might be an extended vacation. Like I said, grad school is tough, so maybe you take an extended vacation, and that results in a bit of a gap. So my own reason for having a gap in my resume if we go back in time, I graduated in 2018 with my PhD, and that same year I started as a research scientist. And I held that position for almost 2 years, or maybe a little bit over 2 years. And at the end of the time, at my research scientist position, I knew I did not want to stay in academia. I had made up my mind there. And really, I had a burning passion for entrepreneurship. As weird as it sounds, I had a couple ideas for different entrepreneurial ventures, some of which I had tried in the past, and I really wanted to try to survive without getting a job or a W-2, survive financially speaking. And so I did a variety of things during that time, everything from short-term rentals to some e-commerce stuff to different online business ventures that I did. One of which ended up becoming relevant to my job search was that I became a data consultant for a small business. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I did that for about a year after leaving my research scientist position. So I took a year to explore these entrepreneurial ideas. And after a year, I said, enough is enough. I've had my fun. I've explored what I wanted to, and I would like a stable paycheck. And at that time, I began applying to jobs, and eventually did get one. But we can go more into that in a little bit. So let's jump back a little bit into gaps in your resume. Why are gaps in your resume important? Well, they're specifically important because recruiters see them as important. They see them as something to look for. And that's really because the unknown is a bad thing for recruiters. So take the perspective of a recruiter for a second. They are responsible for bringing in people to fill jobs, and hopefully those people will A, be well qualified, B, be likable, and then C, they won't leave early. So really, they're looking for anything that would go against those three categories. And so with gaps, recruiters are really looking for red flags. And so some of those red flags may be maybe you job hopped really quickly and you're excluding those short positions from your resume, and so it shows a gap. And recruiters, this is a little bit controversial, but some recruiters do not want to look for people who've job hopped a lot, particularly in the recent past. Others, they don't really care. But so they may be looking for people that are job hopping. They may be looking for you getting fired, and maybe you were fired in a dramatic fashion for doing something pretty bad, and you ended up getting blacklisted from maybe the big companies in your industry, and you were basically unable to get a job because of that. So they may be looking for that. But I think as someone applying to jobs, I think it's important to remember that most reasons for gaps in a resume are fairly acceptable. The ones that I explained at the beginning: caregiving, taking time off, medical leave, even waiting out for another academic job cycle. All of these things can be explained as rational. And I think besides the things I've already talked about, recruiters are also looking for the erosion of skills and expertise. So like most things, if you don't use a muscle or a skill, it erodes over time. And if you're maybe sitting at home not doing anything for 6 months to a year, your skills in, say, data analysis are probably going to go down over time. Not only that, but new applications that come out are probably things that you're not going to be looking into, and so you're not going to be up to speed, and so your knowledge may be a little bit dated. And unless you have like a reason for a gap in your resume that needs to be hidden, it's usually best to not try to hide whatever it was. And recruiters are really good at sensing uneasiness in candidates' responses. So if they feel like you're hiding something, then they're probably going to assume that you're hiding something, and they're probably going to assume that the thing you're hiding is worth hiding. And that may be the reason that they decide to pass over you for a job. So I don't think this next part is fairly common, but sometimes recruiters, when they're asking questions about gap in a resume, are trying to gather information about things that they may technically not allowed to ask about, depending on your state laws, like starting a family, getting pregnant, having small children. Maybe you went to prison for a period of time, and maybe you were in the hospital for a long period of time and you had an illness. These things, again, these are a little bit more nefarious practices that recruiters might do, because they're, in most states, I believe they're not supposed to be able to ask these questions. But so they may be digging around your gaps looking for responses that may go to those categories. Like I said, I think in most cases, honesty is great, but let's jump down to actually what you should be doing to address gaps in your resume, both on your resume and in your interviews. Here we go. How to fix up your resume to address any gaps you might have. So I'm going to tell you just some general things that could be done, and then I'll also tell you what I did. So the first thing right off the bat, if you have a gap in your resume or CV that's only 3 to 6 months, I might not even include that. If it is 6 months to a year, it's probably something worth including. And another way to address that is to actually not list the months in your experience section of your resume. Instead, just list the years. And this really makes more sense if you don't have any positions that you've been in for less than a year. When I think back to my resume, I had been the lab coordinator for years. I had had my research scientist position for years. So it really didn't make sense to list the months. So by listing years instead of months, you may be able to just completely exclude the fact that you were had a gap in your resume for 6 months or so. So another thing that you can do when you're listing a gap is to, if it is a length of time that needs to be listed, don't just exclude information from that section of your experience section where you list the jobs, the positions you've had and your duties. You could actually list that period of time that you had a gap, and you could basically frame it as a job, like structurally, like give the amount of time that you were there and give a brief summary of what you were doing. And this brings us to a great point, and that the experiences that you had during the gap can really spin whether or not recruiters are going to see that gap as a positive thing or a neutral thing or a negative thing. And so here are some things that you should think about. Let's say if you are in a gap right now, maybe you graduated in May or you graduated in December and you're still looking for jobs. Here are some things you should be thinking about. Are you upskilling? Today, in the age of online learning, it is extremely easy to upskill at home, and it's usually not that expensive. I'm a big fan of Coursera. Coursera is a platform where you can take courses. I believe it's for $40 a month, something like that. And that's the platform that I used to brush up on my data analytics skills prior to becoming a data analyst in the healthcare industry. So upskilling is a great way to spend some of your time when you're on a break or you have a gap in your resume. And it doesn't even really need to encompass the whole gap. Of course, you could spend maybe a month out of your 6-month gap doing some upskilling. But as long as you have something to show for it, that'll really help recruiters just decide to overlook or look at the gap as a positive thing in your resume. So upskilling is great. You could learn some new tools that are used in your industry. You could learn some new information about the goings on of your field, whether it's, chemistry or whether it's UX research. And a great thing about a platform like Coursera is they'll have certificates that you can link to. So you could actually hyperlink that part of your resume to go to an online certificate that's usually hosted by Coursera. And that's a great way of just providing external validation to show that you actually were active upskilling during that period of time. And a big bonus if you decide to create a portfolio project. So that's one of the things that I did during my gap. We can go back there for a little bit. So I was doing entrepreneurial things for about a year. Part of my time in entrepreneurship was spent working with small businesses on understanding their customer data and utilizing that customer data in marketing and sales ventures. And so one of the things that I did was I framed that gap in my resume with those details, showing that I was a consultant and describing some examples of what I did during that time. Now, my whole time in that gap, that period of time, was not spent doing those specific activities, but a good portion of that time was. And so that's how I framed that section of my resume. And then I also had some really specific examples that I ended up using in interviews about how the data consulting that I did for a specific small business ended up bringing them a lot more traffic and a lot more calls for services. And so that was a great way to show that, yes, I had this odd gap where I did not have a W-2 job, but during that period of time, I did do productive work and was able to provide value to the people that I was working with. I also did build a portfolio. And so after I took that year, to do entrepreneurial things, and I started applying for jobs, my first venture applying for jobs did not go very well. I applied for about 200 jobs. I got one really undesirable offer that I did not take. And I decided it was probably time to brush up on my skills and learn some of the languages that are more commonly used, specifically SQL and R. And so I did do some upskilling on Coursera, and then I did that for a couple months to complete that course, and then included the certificate that I got from that. I linked to that on my resume to show that I was upskilling during that period of time. And then I created a portfolio project where I used SQL and R to analyze some healthcare data and basically just show that I could unpack data with these programs and create inferences from that. And then I had a portfolio to point to. And really, in between the certificate and the portfolio and the specific examples I had about working as a data analytics consultant, that really shored up that period of time for recruiters where I wasn't getting the same, like, what have you been doing for a year kind of questions that I got the first time I applied for jobs. If you do have a gap in your resume, make sure you have some upskilling. If you can do a portfolio, that's great too, but have something that you can point to show that you've been productive, you've been refining your skills haven't been eroding, they've actually been improving, and that you're ready to jump into the workforce. So a couple other things you could include if you did this during the gap would be like volunteering. Showing that you're a productive member of society is, of course, better than saying that you sat at home and played video games for 6 months to a year. And then, of course, any knowledge you may have gained in an interview that may come up as to like, well, how have you stayed up to date on the knowledge in our little field that we're in? And then a final thing to think about on your resume specifically is if the gap is active, meaning that it is the most recent thing on your on your resume, like it was for me when I was applying for jobs, you can move your skills section above your experiences section. And this is also true this may also be helpful if you don't have any professional experiences in the kinds of jobs you're applying for, which is often the case for grad students when they're trying to get their first industry job and they're not from something like STEM and they're just jumping into an equivalent position in industry. Putting your skills above your experiences makes that the first thing that recruiters see after they get past like your name and contact information and that kind of thing. And then again, bonus points if you have a portfolio, because then you can link the skills to the portfolio. And you can also link your skills to certificates that you've achieved, just to bolster in recruiters' minds that you do actually have some of these skills that you're saying that you do on paper. So again, if that would make sense for you, then you can move your skills above your experiences section. And so that will probably push your experience section down to the bottom half of your resume, which is fine. Really, you want to put your most prominent, most powerful thing at the top of your resume. And for most people, that is their experiences section. But if you're just starting out or you're changing lanes, that may be your skills section. All right, moving on. What to do in interviews if it comes up. I think one thing that is understated is to just be positive. Positivity and confidence go a long way for recruiters, because recruiters are looking, again, if we're talking about a gap, recruiters are looking for people that are hiding something bad. They're hiding a red flag. And so don't do that, number one, because recruiters will probably sniff that out. And don't talk about your gap as a break. Talk about it as a pause, and make sure you talk about the activities that you've been doing, like I said before, whether that's upskilling, working on a personal portfolio or a passion project, maybe you're volunteering or gaining knowledge. And then be honest and positive. Let's say you did take a break to care for an aging parent. You can always mention that. But then come back to the upskilling and knowledge gained, because you really want to show that you're prepared and ready to take on the job. And I think one thing that I've heard can be really beneficial is to show that there's like an ending to the reason why you had a gap, whether that was you had a passion project from academia that you were trying to wrap up for 6 months, or maybe you were taking care of a relative who had gotten sick. Saying that you've finished that project and now you're completely done with that lab and ready to move on. And the person you were caregiving, maybe they've decided to go into a home, or you found like a new permanent caregiver to take over. Really kind of showing that whatever the reason was that you had the break, it was final and is not going to kind of rear up again, can help give recruiters the confidence they need to say, okay, this person's ready to go and we should pick them up. So, all right, just some final reminders before we wrap up. Having a gap is actually really common these days. And I think for grad students, having like a 3 to 6, maybe a 12-month gap after they finish grad school is probably fairly common. Again, assuming you have the financial means to be able to pull that off. And having a gap, especially in the last 20 years, has become really common, especially since the pandemic, has become incredibly common. And recruiters, I think, don't often look at it as negatively as they used to. So I think remembering that and letting that settle in whenever you're preparing to talk about a gap in your resume in an interview is really important, because if you don't make it seem like it's a big problem, recruiters will probably buy your impression that it's not a big problem, and they'll just move on and ask you more important things. Another thing to think about is recruiters really don't view taking time off that bad if you have a great reason. And they actually, I've heard, they view it less negatively than job hopping. So again, if you have a good reason for why you did it, then it's going to be fine. And then the last one is just be calm, be confident, give the reason that you need, and don't overreact. Anyway, so that's the conversation today on gaps in your resume. I hope you got a lot out of this. And if you have a gap in your resume, an active gap like I did whenever you're entering the workforce, I hope these tips will help you kind of prepare both your resume and prepare for interviews and be confident whenever you jump up to the plate and apply for jobs. All right. Thank you all for listening and have a great day. See you all next time.